Hello friends! Today we're going to be talking about absolutely everything you need to know when making a pour over. What a pour over actually is, the parts you're going to need, how to make one, how to use one in a court of law, how to use a pour over as a weapon. It's going to be great. We're going to talk about everything. So let's get into it. Alright, first let's just talk about what actually is a pour over. What does a pour over mean? I'm sure you've heard these terms, pour over, and you probably heard your local barista raving about how amazing a pour over is, and it's like the only way to make coffee because it's like just it optimizes that extraction rate and like you can control everything, right? And well, they're a little bit right. I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of like that barista. But what actually is it? What's the difference between a pour over and your classic drip brewer, right? Because they're both just dosing water on top of ground coffee. So what's the difference? Well, the primary difference in a pour over versus a drip brewer is the manual control that you, as the brewer, have. For most drip brewers, they're just gonna be dosing a fixed amount of water at a fixed temperature for a fixed amount of time, and that's just gonna get you a cup. And yeah, in some like fancier brewers, you're able to actually modify some of those features and kind of customize it a little bit more, but the process itself is still automated. However, for a pour over, you're controlling absolutely everything: the temperature, the flow rate of the water, which parts of your coffee bed get more attention than others, how many pours you do during your pour. So you have absolute control over the entire brew. So that's pretty much it. That's like the primary difference between a pour over and a drip brewer. It just allows more customization and allows more control, which is awesome if you know what you're doing, which you will after this video, because I'm teaching you. All right, now that you know what a pour over is, let's talk about the respective parts that you need to make said pour over. First thing you're gonna need is a kettle. Now, I'm sure you noticed on this kettle, it's a little funky looking, right? We have kind of a nice skinny spout. This is called a gooseneck kettle. These kettles are made specifically for making pour over coffee because they allow far more control in the stream of water as you're pouring, and they allow you to get nice and close to your coffee if that's what you want. Could you make a pour over with your standard everyday kettle? Yes. It's not gonna be quite as precise, but you could. So if you don't have one of these at home, there's no huge rush to go get one. However, if you're looking to step up your coffee game, which based on the fact that you clicked on this video, you probably are, then you might want to get yourself a gooseneck kettle. Highly recommend, very helpful. The next thing you're gonna need is a scale. Now, food scales are super duper helpful when making any form of coffee. Being able to precisely weigh your coffee and your water is really, really helpful in any form of coffee. Now, do you absolutely need a food scale? And do you absolutely need to weigh everything by grams? No, question mark. You could get by simply using just cup measurements or milliliter measurements and could make a decent cup of coffee, but it's a lot harder. These allow for a lot more finite control, so I highly recommend getting yourself a food scale that weighs in grams. Now, you don't need to get something quite as fancy as this. This is kind of an expensive one, but there are some pretty cheap food scales on the market, so definitely look into getting one if you don't already have one. Then the next thing you're gonna need is something to make your pour over in. I have a fancy glass carafe because I'm bougie like that, but you could just make this straight into a cup if you want. I just like using glass carafes for a couple reasons. One, it adds to the experience, and two, if I'm making multiple pour overs in one jug, I can use just the same jug. Then finally, of course, to make a pour over, you need a pour over brewer. Now let's talk about these brewers for a second. So you might notice there are 3 different brewers here. Sort of, kind of 2.5. These 2 are the same, they're just different materials, but they're different in a way. Why do I have 3 different brewers here, and why do most coffee YouTubers have like 10 different brewers? Probably because they have too much money and time in their hands, but there are differences between each of these brewers, so let's talk about them. Firstly, you'll notice a difference in the shape of these brewers. They're both conical, however, the pink one, the origami one, is a bit more jagged, whereas the V60, the Hario V60 here, is more circular and instead just has these lined ribs along the inside. Now, what are these and what is the difference between these two? For most conical pour over brewers, you're gonna see something similar to this, where there's a lot of ribs and kind of gaps between the porcelain and your filter when you put it in. The reason for those ribs is to create something called a bypass when you're doing a pour over. What is a bypass and what is it doing for your coffee? Well, when you make coffee, you have your bed of coffee, right? And when you're pouring water over it, ideally, all your water is gonna drip right through that coffee and extract as much flavor from that coffee as possible. However, the reality is water likes to go down the path of least resistance. So going all the way through that bed of coffee is not the path of least resistance. Instead, what some of your water is going to do is it's going to partially go in, and then it's going to say, hey, it's a lot easier if I just bypass the coffee and kind of escape through the side of the filter and drip down these grooves. And that's essentially what's happening. That's what water bypass is when making a pour over. Now, that might sound bad. You don't want weak, kind of just brown tinted water in your coffee, but it actually is a good thing, and it's exactly why these brewers have ribs in them is to allow for the right amount of bypass. As you're brewing your coffee, a lot of the water that comes through is going to be, for lack of a better term, stronger than other parts of that water. So the bypass, what it's doing is it's partially watering down that stronger coffee and balancing it out more. So we actually want this. That's what these are designed to do. Now, there are some pour over brewers that don't have any ribs whatsoever and they don't have any bypass, and they can make a great cup of coffee as well. However, you just need to adjust what you're doing when you use brewers like that. I'm a big fan of the ribbed brewers, so we're gonna do these today, and these are the most common ones. You'll see, like I said, the Hario V60, super common brewer, probably the most popular pour over brewer. Then we have here the origami dripper, and then we have just a different variation of the V60. It's just a plastic version, but they're all pretty similar. They all allow for a good amount of bypass, so we're gonna use the bypass method. And the final thing you're gonna need to go alongside your brewer are some compatible paper filters to brew with. Right here we have the Hario V60s, so they are compatible obviously with your V60, but they do also work for the origami dripper as well. And there are just a myriad of paper filters out there, so find ones that you like. Okay, we have all of our parts. We're ready to go. Now let's talk about the 5 main factors that are gonna affect your extraction during your pour over. Now, I made a different video that talks about these 5 factors of extraction in more detail and how you need to kind of consider them in all forms of brewing. So I'm not gonna get super detailed here, but I am gonna mention kind of my thought process when I'm making a pour over and how each of these factors are gonna affect my cup. The first factor that I want to think about when making my coffee is the grind size. How coarsely do I want to grind my coffee? Generally speaking, the finer the grind of coffee that you have, the more extraction you're going to get from that coffee. So there is a balance that I want to find in this cup to make sure that I don't grind too finely or too coarsely. There's no perfect grind size for pour overs, let me preface that. However, the standard kind of grind size that you want to aim for is like coarsely ground salt. That's kind of the buzzword that you'll hear a lot. That's pretty much it for grind size. Like I said, the finer you grind, the more extraction you're going to get. So play with that as you need. The next factor you want to consider is your brew ratio. Now, a brew ratio is basically just the ratio of your water with respect to your coffee. So let's say I want a 15-to-1 ratio. If I have 10 grams of ground coffee, that means I'm going to pour 150 grams of water. That's a 15-to-1 ratio. Now, the most common ratios you're going to see out there is anywhere between 14-to-1 to all the way to 18-to-1, and it's quite subjective. It's a pretty big spectrum when it comes to whatever coffee you're making, so play with this as you will. I usually like to just pick one and start there, and then I'll vary depending on how it extracts, basically. The next factor we want to consider is our temperature. How hot are we getting our water when we're brewing our coffee? Now, this is going to vary a good amount depending on what coffee you have in there. Typically, and I say typically, so take this with a grain of salt or a grain of coarsely ground coffee. Typically, the lighter the roast of the coffee, the hotter you want your water to be. That's just because lighter roasted coffees require a bit more energy, a bit more heat to more optimally extract. Now, again, I say typically because this is, again, a pretty big spectrum, and there are some exceptions, and sometimes you might want to go cooler with lighter roasted coffees depending on what you're trying to get in the cup. But let's say you get a new coffee, you have no idea how to brew it, it's a brand new coffee, brand new roaster, and it's a lighter roast coffee. Typically, I'm just going to start pretty hot, around 95 to 96 degrees Celsius, nearly right off the boil for that lighter roasted coffee. Then as the coffee gets darker, I'm going to drop my temperature. So if I'm going a medium roast, I'll do maybe 92 degrees, and then if I'm doing a dark roast, maybe 85 to 87 degrees Celsius. So it doesn't need to be that hot for darker roasts. That's just because it's a bit easier to extract flavors from darker roasts because they are a bit more delicate, I guess, and they're already more broken down from being in the roaster for longer, so they dissolve faster. The next factor that I want to consider is agitation. How much do I want to agitate my coffee while I'm brewing it? And by agitation, I mean like movement. How much do I want to shake up the bed, you know? And there's 2 main ways that you kind of agitate coffee while brewing in a pour over. One is how much water you're pouring at once or how high it is, basically how that stream of water is agitating that bed. And then the second is actually me manually manipulating it by moving it or stirring it or whatever. So it's a factor to consider for sure, because the more you agitate your coffee, the more you're going to extract it. And it's kind of just pretty intuitive. Like if you put sugar in your coffee, for example, which don't do that. I mean, you can, but don't. If you just let it sit in there, it'll eventually dissolve. But if you stir it or agitate it, it's going to dissolve faster, right? So it's the same deal with coffee. The more you agitate it or stir it or move it at all, the faster the soluble compounds in coffee will dissolve. So the more extraction you're going to get. So you got to be careful with how much you agitate it, because if you over agitate, you'll over extract, and obviously vice versa. If you didn't dial in your other factors enough and you under agitated it, you're going to under extract it. So definitely something to consider. be aware of how much you're moving your coffee. And that final factor to be considering is your brew time. Now, your brew time is very important. Ideally, you should be timing any moment that you're making coffee. If you're doing espresso, pour over, AeroPress, whatever it is, you want to have a timer. And that's just because it's kind of your number one universal metric to determine how much extraction you got. Obviously, without using a refractometer and getting super scientific about it, but if your coffee's taking a really long time to drip through, then you can intuit, okay, I extracted more because your water was sitting in with your coffee for a longer period of time. So it's gonna extract the more it's in there. The longer it's sitting in there, the more extraction you're gonna get. So if your brew time isn't what you want it to be, then it's likely that one of your other 4 factors that I was talking about is off in a way. Maybe it's your grind size, maybe it's your brew ratio, maybe it's your temperature, maybe it was agitation, maybe you agitated too much. So brew time is your number one signal that either something is right or something is wrong. So it's very important to time your pour overs. Ideally, the time that we're aiming for is anywhere between 2.5 minutes to 3.5 minutes for a single cup. That's usually gonna lead to a nice, perfect amount of extraction. And that's what we want. That's sweet, sweet extraction. That's that buzzword you're gonna hear me say about 100 more times. Extraction. That's what we want, the perfect amount of extraction. Again, this is a spectrum, so you could get really good cups of coffee at like 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, but typically 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, that's what you want. Okay, now, that was a boatload of information that I just threw your way, and you might be thinking like, relax, that was way too much to think about for making 1 cup of coffee. And I understand, it's a lot of information. But what I do to help simplify things is I will typically just pick one recipe with a specific brew ratio, temperature, grind size, amount of agitation, and an ideal brew time, and I start there. Then from there, I'll see how the coffee tastes. Is it over-extracted? Is it under-extracted? Is it just right? And then I'll adjust one factor at a time. Typically, I start messing around with the brew ratio. If I find it's over-extracted, I lower the brew ratio, put less water in there to try and dial in the extraction. Then if I find my coffee's still not exactly what I want it to be, I'll change another factor, perhaps my agitation, the amount that I'm agitating my coffee. Maybe I'll lessen it or I'll increase it to increase extraction or lessen extraction. Typically, I'll try to mess with grind size last, just so I can keep one factor pretty constant. Unless my brew time is just way off, like it's at 5 minutes, I'll probably coarsen my grind size up a bit. But I usually like to mess with the other factors first and then eventually get to grind size if I find more problems. So take it one step at a time. Maybe you want to just start messing around with agitation. You want to play around with that. You've never agitated or thought about agitation. Start there. Do one thing at a time. You don't need to change all 5 factors. In fact, you shouldn't change all 5 factors at once because it's just too much to consider. Okay, we're getting there. You know what a pour over is. You know what you need. You know the factors to track. How do we make a pour over? What are we doing? So there's 3 main stages of a pour over. There's going to be your bloom stage, your pouring stages, and then your finish. Let's start by talking about the bloom stage. Okay, so blooming. What is this buzzword? What does this actually mean in your coffee? What's it doing? Basically, as your coffee is roasting, it's being filled with CO2 in the little pores within the actual bean. Then when it finishes roasting, from that point on, all the way to the point at which you consume the coffee, your coffee is very slowly degassing that CO2 that's trapped inside. The longer you wait, the more it degasses, which is how coffee ages, that as well as oxidation. Now, ideally, you don't want CO2 in your coffee, right? So you should let it degas until there's none left, right? But that's not actually what you want, because as it degasses, it also releases some organic volatile compounds, and those compounds account for a lot of flavor in your coffee. So if you let it degas or age for too long, your coffee's gonna be old and stale and pretty flat. But if you don't let it degas for long enough, it's gonna be full of CO2 and you're gonna be drinking a bunch of gas, and that's not what you want, right? So, all that being said, there's kind of a perfect time range for a specific coffee to the point where it's degassed enough that there's not as much CO2 in there, but there's still some of those sweet organic volatile compounds that are gonna account for some good flavor. Now, what does this have to do with blooming? Well, the blooming stage is when you are initially introducing water to your coffee. You're saying, hey coffee, here's a little bit of water. Get some of that hydration going. So then when you initially introduce that water into that coffee and you make them shake hands and they become good friends, you'll notice a ton of bubbles coming out of that coffee, ideally if it's a rather fresh coffee. And those bubbles are those last bits of CO2 releasing from our coffee, because there's still some CO2 in there at the point of brewing, ideally. So those bubbles, when it frosts up like crazy, that's what's happening. It's releasing that remaining CO2, which is essentially finishing that degassing process, which is exactly what we want. So that's why blooming is important, because it releases those remaining gases, and we don't want those in our coffee because they taste kind of putrid. They taste gaseous, if that makes any sense. So the blooming stage, in summary, is that initial introduction of water to your coffee, and it allows for the coffee to finish that degassing process, essentially. So to perform your blooming stage, what you're gonna do is you're gonna pour 3 times the amount of water as you have coffee. So let's say we have 15 grams of coffee. I'm gonna pour 45 grams of water, and then I'm gonna let it sit for anywhere between 30 seconds to about 2 minutes. Now, how do I know how long I need to let it sit? Typically, it has to do with the roast of the coffee and the freshness of the coffee. The fresher the coffee, the longer you want it to degas, because there's gonna be more CO2 left in that coffee. And the lighter the coffee, the longer I'm gonna need to let it degas, because darker roasted coffees degas at a quicker rate. So if I have a super light roasted coffee, I'll probably let it bloom for like anywhere between 1 minute and 2 minutes. And if I have a darker roasted coffee or a medium dark roast coffee, I'll let it bloom for like 30, 45 seconds. And again, these are all subjective times, so these are just kind of recommendations. So take what I say and play around with it. Find your perfect blooming time for whatever coffee you're using. Okay, so that's blooming, our initial introduction of water to coffee. Then we have our pouring stages. Now with your pouring stages, there's a couple things to consider. One is how many pours you're gonna be doing, and 2 is how much you wanna agitate your coffee while you're pouring. Like I said, more agitation leads to more extraction. So if you have a coffee that easily extracts, let's say you have a medium dark roast coffee, because those extract a little bit quicker, you might wanna consider less agitation and maybe less pouring stages. Maybe 1 pouring stage and a pretty limited amount of agitation. However, if you have a light roasted coffee, super light roasted coffee, maybe you want to increase that extraction, increase that agitation, and do a couple pouring stages. So maybe you'll do 2 pouring stages and increase the agitation. And when it comes to pours, the more pours you have, the more agitation you are introducing. Basically, if I just pour once, I'm only agitating the coffee once. But if I do 2 pouring stages, then I'm agitating the coffee, letting it settle as it drips through, and then re-agitating that coffee, and then letting it settle again. So more pours equals more agitation. And then finally, we're almost there. We're gonna make coffee soon, I promise. We have our finish stage. Now the finish stage is kind of like a little pseudo stage at the very end of your coffee. It's basically, what are you doing when you finish pouring your coffee? Are you letting it sit and drip through? Are you picking it up and swirling it? Are you jiggling it? Are you tapping it? Are you stirring it? What are you doing and why? And again, this has to do with agitation. If I pick it up and swirl it, or if I jiggle it, or if I stir it, I'm just increasing that agitation. So if I have a coffee that I might be worried about over extracting, I might just let it sit. I'm not gonna touch it, I'm just gonna let it drip through. However, if I have a coffee that maybe I wanna introduce a little bit more agitation, pick it up, give it a little swirl, drop it down, Bob's your uncle, we're good. Typically, I just recommend doing one method and sticking with that, changing everything else, and then if you find you want to change the finish, go for it. I usually just recommend picking it up, giving it a little swirl, and letting it settle. What that little swirl does is it levels out that bed of coffee, so when you finish, you'll have a nice flat bed of coffee, and that's gonna help more evenly extract that coffee. So that's why I recommend that method most of the time. Again, it's subjective. Change it if you want, but ideally pick one and then change other factors and then finally get to your finish. So that is all. That's it. That's how you make a pour over. You have your bloom stage, you have your pouring stages, and then you have your finish. Okay, the time has come. I have just thrown a gargantuan amount of information at you. Let's make a coffee and let's use this information to make the best coffee that you've ever had, hopefully. We're finally gonna make a pour over. You're gonna get that coffee that you've been waiting for all day. Here we go. The recipe that I'm gonna be using today is the recipe that I normally start most light or medium roasts out on, and then I'll adjust from there if I need to. We're gonna be using 15 grams of coffee to 225 grams of water, and that is a 15-to-1 ratio. And I grind my coffee like I showed you, kind of a rough, coarse sea salt. We're gonna use 2 pouring stages. I'm gonna pour to 150 grams to start, and then I'm gonna finish to 225 grams. And for our bloom stage, we're gonna do, like I said, a 3-time pour, so 45 grams, 3 times the amount of coffee, and I'm gonna let it bloom for a minute. And that's the recipe that I usually use for most of my coffees starting out, and then, like I said, I will tailor things specific to the coffee as I go and as I taste. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this paper filter and I'm gonna fold the edge here, the rippled edge. Then I'm gonna toss that into my brewer here. And I'm gonna pour some water over it so it seats nice and snugly into my brewer and it's nice and saturated. The reason we pour water over this is a couple reasons. Like I said, it seats the paper filter nicely in the brewer, and it also gets rid of any leftover papery taste that might be in the filter. So make sure you give it a good soak. You can also just run it under some water at your tap as well. That works pretty well as well. But if you do use your kettle, just make sure to dump out that extra water that falls into your carafe here. All right, that's seated nicely in my brewer. I'm next gonna take my coffee, I'm gonna turn my scale on, and then I'm gonna dump my coffee into my scale. And like I said, I'm using 15 grams of my coffee here, and I'm using the Sweet Justice from Equator Coffee, our location here. And it is a light to medium roast. On the scale of 1 to 8, it is a 4 on the roasting scale. So it's about right in the middle, but it kind of manifests a little lighter. Now that my coffee's in my brewer, I'm just gonna give it a little shake to level out the bed. And then I'm gonna set it down, and then I'm gonna take my finger and I'm actually gonna make a little divot in my coffee. What that's gonna do is it's gonna kind of push the coffee up around the edges, and that way it's kind of mimicking the shape of the brewer. So when I pour water over it, it more evenly wets the bed. And that's kind of what we should be left with there. Now that my coffee is evenly distributed, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tare my scale so that it's back to 0. And then we're gonna actually start pouring. So I'm gonna do the bloom stage here first. And like I said, I have 15 grams. So the bloom stage, I'm gonna pour 3 times the amount of coffee that I have, which is 45. So I'm gonna pour 45 grams of coffee. And this coffee was roasted about 2 weeks ago. So I don't need to let it bloom for too long. I'm gonna let it bloom for about a minute because it is a lighter to medium roast. And however, it is a couple weeks old, so it doesn't need as much time. So here we go, bloom stage. As I start pouring, I'm going to start my timer as well. And make sure when you're pouring your bloom stage to evenly saturate all of the coffee in your brewer, making sure everything gets wet. And you should see a nice level of kind of frothiness. It's gonna be bubbling up in there a little bit. That's that CO2 getting released. All right, it's been 45 seconds, so I'm gonna start pouring, and I'm gonna pour all the way to 150 grams. And as I pour, I wanna pour relatively quickly, create a good amount of agitation in my bed, because like I said, this is a lighter to medium roast coffee. So I don't need to be too delicate with this one. It should take me about 10 to 15 seconds to get to 150 grams. Then I'm gonna let that drip through. I'm not gonna touch it in the meantime. I'm just gonna let it fully drip through until I'm just about seeing that coffee bed, and then I'll do my next pour to 225 grams. All right, now that I can just about see my coffee bed, I'm gonna go in for the next pour and pour all the way to my 225 grams. All right, now that I'm at 225 grams, I'm gonna pick it up, give it a little bit of swirl just to even out that bed, and then I'm gonna put it back down, and I'm gonna let it drip on through, and that's all you need to do, folks. As I was pouring, you saw that I was moving in a circular motion. That's typically what you wanna do when you're doing a pour over, to make sure everything is getting evenly soaked. And as you're doing that motion, it's also increasing the agitation. So take that into account. If you want to limit the agitation, maybe move a little bit less. But for this coffee, I want a good amount of agitation, so I'm moving in circles as I go, making sure everything's getting saturated and increasing that agitation. It's also kind of intuitive. This is a circular brewer, so you kind of naturally want to move in a circular motion as well. So it makes sense. And she's all dripped through, and then when you're done, if you give that coffee a swirl, you'll notice that your bed is gonna finish nice and flat. There won't be any kind of mountains or valleys in there, and that's kind of what you're looking for when you do that swirl. And then we're all finished, folks. Like I said, we're aiming for a 2.5 to 3.5 minute extraction. So I'm gonna take off my brewer here, and we're gonna give it a nice taste. It's my favorite part. You notice it's a nice, deep kind of reddish brown. That's what you want out of your nice specialty coffee. Give it a nice taste. Make sure to slurp as loud as you possibly can. Annoy everyone in your house. That's exactly how you want to drink coffee. Delicious. And this is a nice, bright, lighter coffee. It's got a good amount of acidity to it. It's got some nice caramel-like sweetness. There's not a lot of bitterness to this coffee, which is great. If you find your coffee's finishing rather bitter, then perhaps you over-extracted it, so maybe adjust some things. Or if you find your coffee's really like juicy or just kind of pungent, then maybe you under-extracted. So again, adjust some factors, dial those bad boys in. There's quite an art to dialing in pour-overs. Lance Hedrick has a very phenomenal video for dialing in pour-overs. He goes through 6 different coffees and he dials each and every one of those in. So I definitely recommend checking out that video. But I appreciate you guys taking the time to learn about pour-overs. I know I threw a ton of information your way, but hey, if you clicked on this video, then that's what you were looking for, right? Or you're one of my trainees at Equator and you're being forced to watch this video, so sorry. Now, there's a whole world of pour-over information out there. I still haven't covered everything that there is to know. So if you want to dive deeper into it, definitely get into it, do more research, learn your style, learn everything you like about coffee, and just go crazy about it, man. The coffee world is awesome. And thanks again for watching this video. I appreciate it. We'll see you in the next one. Bye, friends.